Right, so we're going to have a fascinating conversation about outrage culture, left-wing politics, what it feels like to be a centrist, how you found the left, Marxism. Yeah.
So mostly Jade doing the talking.
Probably. Oh dear.
How it feels to be a centrist. I love how that's like you're an oppressed minority group. Tell us.
Right.
The thing is, it is an oppressed minority, but
Right, let's not go there before we get started.
okay.
Right. Welcome back to another edition of the Elliot Reeves Show. I am Elliot Reeves, and today I'm joined by two intellectual heavyweights. I have to my immediate left, Gavin Morrice and Jade Saab. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you
for having us.
I was really
It's
hoping you
pleasure.
would say, and to my far left.
That would be very apt.
In the centre, Gavin Morrice.
Which implicitly makes me right. Let's not go there. Let's not do that. So, the idea of today's conversation, I mean, you guys have at one stage or another been relatively deep into kind of social issues and politics and the like, and I thought this would be a really good opportunity to catch up and maybe discuss some of the sort of higher level themes and then maybe dig a little deeper and see where we go with that. So, Gavin, we'll start with yourself. I mean, if you can give a rough kind of bio, your background, and that sort of stuff would be good.
Sometimes I describe myself as a failed blogger.
Okay.
So I'd always had a background in coding, and when I was about 21, I decided to set up my own blog because I'd been reading about other professional bloggers and how they were making good money from doing it. And I thought, hey, I can do that. So I coded my own blog site, but in doing that, I had someone else say, "Oh, hey, can you do a website for me?" And I said, "Okay, sure." And then that became more work, and eventually I found myself working as a freelance web developer. Which then, a few years of doing that, I decided to start my own company. So now I run a software company where we develop web applications and help startups to kind of form their ideas, build them and launch them. And in my spare time, I like to get involved in philosophy and politics.
Hmm?
And I don't blog. I don't blog nearly as much as I'd hoped. That kind of just fell to the wayside. But
Okay.
yeah.
Good intro. Jade, yourself.
This is going to be hard to follow. I don't know where to start. I mean, writing is a big part of my life, but I always feel weird saying I'm a writer. I think that kind of comes off as a bit weird. And there's also this idea that unless you've published a book, then you can say you're a writer or something like that till you've had some kind of market validation for who you are. Then it's valid. But yeah, that's pretty much. I spend most of my time writing and reading philosophy. So whether or not that makes me a writer, then that's.
Sounds like it does.
Yeah, all right, I'll take it. I'll take it.
So I remember meeting, the first time I met you guys was probably maybe a year and a half ago, and you had co-founded a platform at the time called Reformer, which was really a conduit to sort of political and social discussion and informing people about what's happening in the world. How did that start in the first place?
Do you want to take this one, Jade?
I'm not even sure. I remember you were over at mine, and then, or was that just when we were picking the logo and we had already made the decision to start it?
We were drunk. I remember that part. No, I think Jade and I mean, we had met through different sort of social networking groups and whatnot. And we always found ourselves in the corner sort of getting really drunk and really deep into political discussion and political debate. So we had kind of realized that in each other, that we were both into the same sort of things and had different takes on certain ideas. So it was very interesting and very energizing to chat with each other. And this was, during the sort of build up to the Trump election and whatnot. We just started to feel that the way people were engaging with each other and the way that they were discussing political issues was not constructive. There wasn't enough deep analysis, enough listening to the other side, enough discussion. It was all just people throwing shit at each other and hoping that something sticks. And so we wanted to sort of create a platform where we could write and where other people could write. And the idea for the platform was to be sort of relatively neutral in terms of we didn't have an agenda that we wanted to put forward. We just wanted to have a space where people could voice their opinion and then also allow other people to rebut their opinion. And that became Reformer.
Yeah, the key kind of term for me whenever I discuss Reformer is context. And there are a lot of, arguments in politics being made against whatever you have, minus any kind of overarching context, be it historic, be it political, ideological theory, whatever. So you end up having these people going back and forth with no kind of, it's just very, very empty. And I remember a big part for me was I had just recently moved to Scotland. This was maybe a year and a half. And at the time there was still the what they call the refugee crisis, and it was weird for me as an Arab to experience it through a kind of Scottish or UK or whatever Western lens you want to call it. And my entry point into writing was to present a broader context on these kind of political issues. And I remember when one of the things that pushed us to actually start Reformer was an article we read in The Independent by a blogger, writer, whatever you want to call him, who was advocating the stance that if we pull out of bombing Syria, because at the time that was a debate that was happening, then it's like we're taking the side of terrorism. And Gavin and I read this and we were just like, this is like how does something like The Independent publish something like this that is so built on such a false dichotomy, between we either bomb people or we're, with or against kind of narrative. And it's funny because Reformer kind of is a good metaphor for like Gavin and I's political relationship as well. Because when we started Reformer, I mean, Gavin and I were both looking for kind of the same thing. I think maybe we are still looking for the same thing, but our paths somewhere along the line kind of diverged and then diverged more and more. And then so yeah, it's interesting that we started with Reformer and then here we are now.
So since then, Gavin, you've kind of backed out of Reformer, but Jade, you're still part of it.
So I'm still trying to keep it alive and seeing where it'll go.
I mean, if you want me to expand on that a little bit, I think for me personally, I started to feel that involvement and engagement in politics was really starting to suck the life out of me. And having other priorities, running a company and whatnot, I just felt like it wasn't how I should be using my energy, and that was why I pulled out of it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because I've done the reverse of what you've done. It seems.
Good luck.
It seems, yeah. Well, so just to sort of give this some context as well. Before I met you guys, I consciously had no interest in politics whatsoever. There was a video posted by a chap that I recently interviewed on Inspired Edinburgh, Peter Sage. And he does this 15-minute rant about why it's about the mainstream media, but the message to me that the two things are they kind of intersect, and the fact that the media just is perpetuating is the word, isn't it? Yeah. So the media is perpetuating this, just like bombarding you with negative information all the time, and actually, if you avoid it altogether, in my experience, you live an altogether happier, better life. That's my personal opinion.
I think you internalize a lot of the negativity. That's
you do, and you unconsciously. You can't avoid it. Your body has been programmed to respond to negative stimuli. And so when you're getting, it's, they say the newspapers are something like a ratio of 10 to 1. So there's like one positive message to 9 negatives. And your amygdala is just on overdrive, and you're just constantly, so it puts you in a negative frame of, or a negative energy space. And it's just, it's not good. It's not good. But anyway, So having met you guys, I found myself curiously being drawn into the sort of political discussions because I felt as though it was a place that actually there were some semblance of intelligent conversation going on, if that makes sense.
I mean, yeah, that's very, very nice of you.
But in terms of, I mean, we can get, we will, we'll undoubtedly get more into this. But people like your Jordan Petersons and, Sargon, Paul Joseph Watson, those guys, their intelligence aside, the fact remains like what they're talking about has some substance to it.
It has some appeal to it, I would say.
Well, possibly, yeah.
On that point of appeal, I think one of the other reasons that I started to sort of distance myself from mainstream discussion of politics was that a lot of the issues that I see as being the real, material issues that would really improve people's lives are not the issues that become the sort of main talking points in whatever given day. So, things like the housing crisis, we need to build more homes. It's a very practical but also a very mundane issue. It doesn't get nearly as much coverage as anything
Brexit.
Trump. Anything Trump says or something.
Yeah,
like that.
yeah, absolutely.
And,
yeah, so true.
So I started to feel really frustrated that the more I looked into what I considered to be the policy aspect or policy issues that could have a real marked improvement on people's lives, the more I realized that these are not the issues that people wanted to talk about.
Oh yeah, completely.
I mean, I think that's sorry.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, I was just going to say we live in an outrage culture, and we can get into that as well. Sorry, Jade.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where I think the starting point is. What do you define as politics, and a lot of it, I try to differentiate between pop politics, which is what you usually see with your Jordan Peterson, Sargon, etc., with politics that's more about policy, what's happening that immediately impacts your life, usually in whatever bodies of governance are in your country. And then you have political theory or political philosophy, which is kind of the overarching narrative behind these kind of smaller political things. But yeah, I kind of want to go back to your point about this negativity and being sucked into politics. I think a really important thing to differentiate is the ability to step aside and say politics doesn't impact me. I don't know where we draw the line on who is or who isn't impacted. So for example, growing up in Lebanon, it's very difficult to not be into politics or not be involved at some level about what's happening around, because every single decision is going to impact you the day after. It's just that defunct, that not being involved. You just can't afford to not be involved, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah.
And then, the three of us are, we come from rather comfortable backgrounds, and we can just live our lives and not be fussed with things like maybe the minimum wage or the housing crisis or things like that, while as other people are being impacted, based on policy. I think that's an important thing to make, that this idea that we can just detach ourselves. I think there's a romantic aspect to it, and one of your favorite writers, Thoreau, in Walden, talks about this idea of just going and living alone, being let alone. And I think some of us just can't afford, that kind of lifestyle or that kind of detachment. So I think this is more of a, a realist versus kind of maybe, I don't want to use the term fantasy, but an idealist approach to politics. That, yes, I can cut myself off from everything and then just focus on me, so to speak. But then obviously we are impacted by things that happen around us, definitely to different degrees. I just felt like
no, not at all. I remember actually, because I interviewed you it would have been at least a year ago, and one of the, I can't remember verbatim what you said, but to paraphrase, it was something along the lines of, if you're frustrated and you want things to change, your route to change is through politics. And it really stuck with me. I never really, I suppose, quizzed whether or not I agreed with that fully or not. But so maybe that was part of the reason that I sort of got more involved in it. But so on a more fundamental level, I mean, I think it would be interesting for people to maybe sort of break down to some extent the political spectrum explain how it works and where you guys sit on it would be really interesting.
Do you want me to take this one?
Yeah, you're well placed
You
because
can
you wrote a
start.
great article
Yeah.
about this.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, so I wrote an article.
Once upon a time,
Statement. I wrote an article.
failed blogger writes article.
So you can measure individuals on a variety of different things. There you go.
Sorry,
Whiskey
break.
A simple example might be how introverted versus extroverted you are.
Mm-hmm.
And you can add multiple dimensions to create more and more complex models.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a model that exists called the political compass, which effectively it's kind of a useful model to position people roughly based on where you think they would sit on certain issues. And the two axes that people are measured on is left and right, which is traditionally thought to be how much you favor equality and or equity rather than equality, how much you favor sort of redistribution of resources and whatnot, versus how much you think people should be more free from external interference and free to succeed to whatever level they may achieve on their own steam, sort of thing. So that's the sort of, in this model's sense, the main distinction between left and right is how level do you want the playing field to be.
Yep.
And then the kind of other axis of that model is the authoritarian and libertarian one, and that's actually the one that I'm more interested in, because one of the key sort of, I guess, ideological journeys for me has been understanding authority and how it impacts the individual. I mean, this is one of the things that Jade and I really bonded on, is that we both really don't like power structures that interfere with people's ability to live their life the way they want to. And that can manifest itself in the most sort of explicit ways, like totalitarian regimes and whatnot, and it can manifest itself in more subtle ways, like churches and whatnot. You know, having communities around you that expect you to behave a certain way. And so how authoritarian versus how libertarian a person might be really defines how likely you are to live and let live versus how likely you are to enforce other people to behave in the way that you expect them to behave.
Right, okay. These are very fundamental ideas that you're sharing. Yeah, I like it.
And so that gives you kind of, if you can envision a grid with 4 squares and 2 axes, and you've got authoritarian, libertarian, and left-right from the camera's perspective. And you can do sort of simple quizzes to sort of place how you might be positioned on that model. Like most models, it's a heuristic, it's a rough approximation rather than an exact science. But I tend to fall down on like smack bang in the center in terms of the left and right divide.
Yep.
Which is why we call me a centrist. And then in terms of the authority and liberty aspect of it, I tend to be very far down at the bottom, very much on the libertarians side of that scale.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. So what are your 3 greatest priorities? What would you say they were? From a political perspective.
Well, I mean, I think...
You know, like in terms of freedom of speech, are you pro-guns? Are you...
I generally want to strike a balance between maximizing people's freedoms, and so that includes things like freedom of speech, but also maximizing people's opportunity to have those freedoms.
Okay.
So you can, and there are sort of systems where when one person is more free, or one person can be so free that their freedom can be to oppress other people. So it's about striking a balance of freedoms rather than giving absolute freedom. And that's basically what liberal philosophy is all about. It's kind of diving into how these things are structured and what's the interactions and what are the responsibilities between individuals.
Rousseau has a great quote. I can't remember it, but something to the extent that the biggest challenge of government is creating that social kind of protection while at the same time, defending individual rights. And that, that is the question of politics, at least liberal politics. I mean, the way I would break down the spectrum is a bit different than Gav.
Same here slightly.
For me, because I think, and if you do I think doing the political compass test is a really good kind of starting point. But the political compass will not ask you questions like, do you believe in democracy, or do you believe in private property, or things like that.
It doesn't step outside the sort of the current paradigm that most people live in the West.
Yeah. So it is. I mean, from an ideological perspective, it is for me still a liberal tool. So when we talk about, economic left, you're talking about someone who wants to curtail capitalism, who wants to use capitalism in a more social way. The typical example is, your Nordic countries or things like that. While as right is more economic, laissez-faire, or let the market figure itself out.
Capitalistic.
Yeah, and even on the authoritarian to libertarian, I think you're right in that is more interesting, because that is purely a power dynamic, and that does translate across all ideologies. While as the left-right can get to the point where it's not as useful. So for me, I like to expand that narrative to include other ideologies. I know ideology does, or has maybe become like a bad word to say.
4-letter word, isn't it?
Yeah, like you're so ideological, and it's and my argument is that we all are, just most of us aren't kind of aware that we've grown up into an ideology and we've just adopted it without really recognizing it. So that's where I find the kind of limitations to that model, because there are points where you have an absolute schism and you need to move to something else, like Marxism and complete abolition of private property. That's nowhere that's nowhere to be found on kind of that test. Or the complete
you're right.
far right, we don't believe in democracy, that's not there. I mean, definitely you can score very high on authoritarian, but that doesn't even fall in kind of the liberal economic idea. It's just all state,
it's true. And the axis that you're describing, it can have you, staunchly anti-immigration, but pro-legalizing cannabis, and you end up in the center, like... there's these kind of...
Who's that guy?
It's definitely a heuristic. So it has its limitations.
I mean, yes and no, because it's an interesting aspect of just how people function, that people tend to cluster in ideas. So you'll very rarely find someone who is, let's say, for example, who's very sort of right-wing, very religious fundamentalist, and who is pro-abortion. I mean, and it's not necessarily that the person's not capable of taking each issue on its own merit. It's just that we tend to, because we socialize our own viewpoints so much, we get them from our society and we influence our society in a sort of interplay. What generally happens is that people who hang out together cluster views together, and you end up with these pockets of viewpoints rather than what you might expect to see, which would be an individual who can have independent views on a variety of issues.
Which is how I would perceive myself to be, very much so. Yeah, I take every issue in isolation rather than look at it as a...
I think that's a very great way to be. It's a very unusual way to be, because people are lazy. They take a lot of their opinions from people around them as well.
Makes voting a big challenge as well.
I'm going to jump in here, and I think the idea of that individual issues are completely detached from each other is a bit of a strange way to look at it. So I would make the argument that economic policy will be influencing a lot of other what we might classify as social issues.
Try to speak into the mic a little bit more, by the way.
Yes.
Just to make sure that you can pull it up to your face a little bit. Just to make sure that we're getting a decent quality audio.
Okay.
So, Jade, how do you identify politically?
So,
brace yourselves.
Yes, I identify as a Marxist. Yes.
Which is to somebody who has no idea of politics whatsoever.
I mean,
Tell the folks at home what
does that
Marxism
mean?
is.
Yeah,
What does that mean?
I'll jump into. I'll answer a question you asked Gav. Like, what are the top 3 things? So
Yeah,
for
yeah.
me, it would be abolition of private property,
Jeez.
abolition of the
Jeez.
state.
Jeez. Abolition of the state.
Yes.
See, for me, that's
Who's
closer
going to
to
abolish the private property?
That's closer to anarchism than it is Marxism.
Well, that's a really interesting point. I think
Sorry, I'm interrupting you, but I'll just
no,
let you...
no. I think that's actually a really important point, and you know that goes into defining our terms.
Yeah.
I think the idea that Marxism is very separate from anarchism comes more from like 20th century politics, and especially like Leninism, which I would classify as maybe a form of Marxism or a Marxist interpretation.
Mhm.
And that was very anti
Everything.
anarchist, anti everything. I mean, and that's the funny thing about, you know, calling yourself a Marxist. You still have to defend yourself against other people who call themselves Marxists. So it's actually really important to kind of define the terms.
Yes.
And sometimes the best way to do that, and this is where people listening can go like, oh, what's he talking about, is by other Marxist philosophers and in relation to their arguments and, you know, what happened in their time. So so that's where it gets a bit maybe overwhelming. And I think because, and I think this feeds back into my point about we have been raised within an ideology, which is an overarching liberal ideology, that anything outside of that is just seen as so radical and so crazy and things like that.
Yeah, yeah. You did a TEDx talk, A World with No Money.
Yes, yeah, yeah. My friend called it thinly veiled communist propaganda.
How might that work in a couple of sentences?
Oof. That was a 20-minute talk.
I know.
You're putting me on the
I
spot.
know.
The essential argument is for democratic control of the economy. So our ability to immediately and directly influence what happens with our resources. Yeah, I think that's the elevator pitch.
How were your ideas formed? How were they shaped?
I mean, I think this is the really interesting bit. I always say I'm the least read Marxist. Like, I'm the least Marxist read Marxist. I don't know. Like,
He means nobody reads his stuff.
I mean, in terms
Marxists hate him.
You just remember, liberals hate him. He has this one trick. No, I mean, in terms of the things that I personally read, I actually spend most of my time reading liberal philosophy as opposed to Marxist philosophy. And it was through that process that I actually got further and further into Marxism, because I read liberal authors, you know, John Stuart Mill, Thomas Paine, John Locke, you know, the what people now, I guess, identify with classical liberalism, even though, you know, each one of them still has a different idea. And, you know, every time I'd read one of their books, I'd feel that there is this contradiction within their ideas. And sometimes it's like really palpable, especially if you read Thomas Paine, for example. You know, his idea of why we should have democracy and not kings is so that we can redistribute the wealth kings are spending on what he calls useless wars. So if you think about British history with, you know, the French wars and all of that kind of stuff. So, and then you have John Stuart Mill, who is rather more idealistic in his thinking. It's more about, you know, where does the individual belong in society, etc. And then you go, okay, this is all great, but how are we going to get there? You know, there's even a section of John Stuart Mill's book where you read it and you go, this guy's an anarchist. Like, he flat out doesn't want the existence of a state.
There's no government like no government.
Yeah.
Well, Jade mentioned Thoreau earlier. One of my favourite quotes from Thoreau was, I heartily accept the motto that which governs least governs best.
Yeah.
And this is an interesting kind of overlap between what is now being called libertarian, because libertarian originally, that meant more about anarchist, but now it's taken as like a free market libertarian kind of thing.
Yeah, there's some dark corners to the libertarian world for sure.
Yeah, there is definitely. But there is some overlap between, like, if you want to say Marxism or anarchism and libertarianism, what's being now called libertarianism, which is this kind of disdain for the state and authority.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's really painful. I have a friend of mine who identifies as a libertarian, and like, you know, halfway through the conversation we're in complete agreement, and then, you know, one thing happens and we're like, no, we were so close. We were so close.
How did you form your views, Gavin?
Wow. I think so one of the some of the reading material that really
Listening to Sargon lots.
No, it was I think so. In terms of temperament and personality, I'm very much of the sort of live and let live, just want to be left alone to live myself in peace kind of thing. Don't like too much external interference, don't like too many people telling me how and what I should be doing. And I think I kind of get that from my dad. My dad's very similarly wired in that sense. In terms of my personal background, I grew up in what I would describe as a very authoritarian, conservative, like Christian church and Christian school, and really hated the way they tried to shape me and really bucked back against it. So I think my sort of adolescence and early 20s was really a lot of me trying to undo a lot of what they tried to do in terms of how to wire me. And so, yeah, I developed a lot of this sort of sense of trying to work out things for myself. I want to solve my own problems in life. I want to work out my own way. And so for me, what I describe as my own libertarianism is very much a sense of, we have a set of ground rules for how we should treat each other, which is the law, which is I don't steal your stuff, I don't hurt you, I don't this and that. And outside of that, it's really up to me to live my life the way I want to. And I think that was the path, and that was the foundation to how I started to build my political views.
I like it. Mine was mostly by doing these tests.
Internet tests.
Internet tests.
Which Friends character are you most like?
Tell us, Elliot, what Disney princess are you?
Well, I mean, according to most of the tests, I do fall mostly in the centre. Sometimes I lean slightly left in terms of social issues, like redistribution of wealth and things like that. You know, I don't really advocate corporations earning, you know, churning over massive amounts of turnover and then it just going to shareholders, you know, when they're doing very little in terms of their social sort of policy to actually help make society better. It's like, if you've got all that wealth, I don't advocate punishing someone for their success. So, for example, we've got billionaires in the world. I don't think that it's fair to just simply confiscate their money or, you know, put sort of punitive tax measures on them. But there should be some, there should be an onus on them to like do the right thing, make the world a better place, not just exist for the sake of greed.
Why?
Why should they?
Well, what the reason I'm asking is, what's the kind of basis for you having that opinion?
Yeah. I mean, well, if we don't do that, well, I mean, look, if you take a sort of Darwinian argument and say it's survival of the fittest, then the people that are poor will just ultimately die out, and you'll just have a rich society, you know. And I don't agree with that. Or they just decay and become worse and worse and worse. Like,
I think it's plausible that you could have a very wealthy upper class and certainly have the lower classes suffering, living a subsistence existence. For sure.
I mean, the lower classes today probably aren't as low as they were 100 years ago. you know, things have gradually improved, but I think why do I think that? So I think in order to make, you know, maybe it's idealistic, but in order to make the world a better place, in order to have a society whereby everyone lives, you know, at least at a sort of threshold level of they can live in a home.
I think,
you know, I think
Elliot
that's
is
a basic
touching on the other aspect of the human nature argument. And I think Rousseau has a great part about this. Rousseau is, I mean, it can be argued whether or not he's a liberal writer, but he's one of my favorite philosophers by far, and he has this term called what translates in English into self-love, and he argues that it's actually philosophy that takes us further away from our innate human tendencies, which tend to be care, love for the other,
of course,
empathy, that kind of thing.
Well, unless you're completely devoid of compassion, there should be some sort of instinctive thing in you that you want to kind of do the right thing and kind of help other people.
I think that happens.
I want us to remember this because I'm 100% sure later in the conversation but human nature is greedy argument is going to come up.
No.
I believe that as well. Yeah, I believe that as well. I believe that's what's wrong.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think
people are inherently greedy.
So you think there needs to be a social correct, like a mechanism to correct that inherent
education,
greed?
Probably.
Okay.
Parenting and education.
Okay.
Yeah, instill proper values in people from the outset, so that if you become a billionaire, you're willing to give 100 million to help house people that don't have a house.
I think the reason that I jumped on that point.
It's interesting because I've never really thought about it. It's just something that's inherent, I guess.
I guess it's the word should, because I agree that I want to live in a world where the people who have the means to improve things do. And we see that in some cases, Bill Gates is about to cure malaria, that kind of thing. But is it should in the sense of, well, I think they really should do that? Or is it should in the sense of we have some laws in place, for example, some social structure that says you must do this?
No, I think that's...
So you're really advocating for a sort of cultural shift where we say that if you're doing well, then...
because it becomes a bit sort of totalitarian to say that, well, actually, because you've got X, you have to give some to other people.
So
I don't really... I'm
going to come in
support
from the
that
far left here.
Oh, no. Uppercut.
No, I think
Sorry.
I think because of this... So one, I think there's something really dangerous with this idea that you proposed about we need to educate people about a certain way of living. So I'm actually with you on this, because then you get into the argument of, well, who is to decide what is the right way, who is, all of these things, and you end up with, at the end of the day, an
social
authoritarian going, this is the way it should be, and any deviation must be squashed. Which, interestingly enough, is the way I see our current system, is that the way it must be is, you need to earn a living, and we want people to be philanthropic. Is that the right word? Yeah. But then, you talk about risk and people who build themselves to be billionaires, but who's really taking the risk, who's really doing the work, who's really doing all of these things. So my view is that we already live in a society where we are able to provide all of these things for ourselves. So that automatically takes out this idea that, we need to take things away from billionaires. I'm in no way trying to advocate that we should take things away from people. I think that things should be democratized, and that these things, to begin with, for someone to become a billionaire, it involves him taking something away from others, mainly their labor, whatever they create through their labor. So a simple kind of catch-all phrase is labor is entitled to everything it creates. So we don't have that right now in our profit system. Is no, I'm going to pay you for your labor, whatever the market determines is right for me to pay you. And then I'm going to sell whatever it is you make at a profit, and I'm going to pocket that profit. So that's where for me, that's where the starting point of inequality is.
Okay.
It's this idea that someone is more deserving of someone else's labor.
Okay. So let's take the abolition of private property then. So I had a thought, a thread, and it's kind of lost it. But let's use a hypothetical scenario whereby you've got a billionaire who owns 20 houses around the world. If you do away with private property, he owns no houses, right?
Well, that's not the idea. The idea isn't to take away things. It's why does he have those 20 houses when...
Because he bought them.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, but how did he buy them? How did he get the money, etc.? Like starting at the yes, he bought them. That's looking through a social dynamic through a financial lens. But obviously, for me to be able to, to be able to employ someone, it means I need to have something that someone else wants. So you are starting from an unleveled playing field, and people think that, once we had our liberal revolutions, which I always like to emphasize were bloody and were horrendous, especially if you look at the French Revolution, because everyone thinks, communism is so violent, and how do you think we got here? Is we think that, well, now we're equal, especially, and I'm going to get into a more complex analysis here. We think that there's one person, one vote system. And we briefly spoke about this last time we met. It's this idea that, people do inherently want to vote for whatever is in their benefit. I mean, I think the great thing about Marxism is that I can argue it from the side that people are inherently, like selfish or want the best for themselves.
Yeah.
So if we left it for people to vote, they would vote for, let's say, a higher minimum wage or things like that, if we gave them that power. Right now they vote for representatives, etc. But at the end of the day, that decision of should we have a higher minimum wage, which for me translates as should we all have a higher standard of living, becomes completely convoluted by the idea of private property. Because if then this passes, you're going to have people in Parliament going, yes, but if we have a higher minimum wage, companies are going to be afraid and then they're going to relocate. So this is what we're talking about in terms of private property. In Marxism, we call the means of production, right?
Yes.
So suddenly, even though it's one person, one vote, obviously the power dynamic still lays a lot within those who own the means of production. And then things like minimum wage, policies that can benefit all of us equally. So again, going back to not really taking things away, but how do things benefit all of us together? Why does this person feel the need to own 20 houses, when you can live a fulfilled lifestyle without that, unless that is the way you want to fulfill your lifestyle, then it should never come at the expense of someone else. So that's kind of the idea. That's the limited resources argument. So yeah, I went on a bit of a tangent there.
Well, I think I take a far more, a far less cynical and more sort of optimistic view of what labour and what employment is. I see it as an opportunity.
Okay.
And it's, I mean, not everybody loves their job. That's a fact of life, right?
50% kind of don't.
No, it's
UK,
more than that. 70% of people in
more?
the US are disengaged
Okay,
or
yeah.
actively disengaged.
So I was thinking UK and Canada.
74%, I believe.
Because of that, I put it in my, it was part of my TED Talk.
Yeah.
I remember that statistic.
And I mean, I can happily accept that there might be some cultural changes we need to make in terms of working fewer hours or, working better conditions, that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, individuals have things they want. They have goals. You might want to go to university. You might want to start a family. You might want to buy your own house. And someone's providing you with an opportunity to earn the means to do that. And so that's the reality of our system. And I see it as a very positive thing. And I think that actually there's a positivizing force in society and in the world where actually those opportunities are becoming better and better as we progress technologically and progress, in society.
I mean, I'd argue against that, seeing how we're facing like climate disaster and 75% of people are not engaged at work.
Let's not discuss climate change today.
So whatever, however you want to try it, it's really funny. I actually was with a friend and we were having a very similar discussion, and they went, work is an opportunity for me to do what I like. And I think the fallacy in that is that you need to be recognized externally by an employer for you to be able to do something you like.
But there's also, in a practical sense, like your employer often provides you with means to do things that you wouldn't be able to do by yourself. Like maybe you want to be a TV news anchor and you can't afford your own news station.
Yeah.
Right, so it's almost a socializing of the resources to do a thing.
No, I think that's a beautiful thing you just said.
Because I used the word socializing.
No, let me tell you why. Because I think you touch at what's at the root of this debate is in politics, we really like to try to separate the economy from social relations, from the way people interact. And for me, it's the exact opposite, is that the economy right now is what completely governs our social interactions. So going back to the idea of okay, fine, let's say I concede to the point that I don't, but let's say I do concede to the point that work is an opportunity and your boss gives you whatever. At the end of the day, the boss's initiative is to actually improve their bottom line. They don't care what your hopes and dreams are. They care how much bang for their buck they can get on paying you your salary.
So I think that's a very cynical view of bosses.
No, that's 100% what it is. And I've worked in the HR field, right? You have sick day policies for this reason. And I'm going to kind of piggyback on that, on the idea that, we need better workplace legislation or whatever that is, that the ways these are achieved, and if you look historically, as every kind of labor legislation is through labor struggle. It wasn't some democratic person because benevolently going, yes, I believe in the workers. It was people fighting for it, and at times, I mean, not to be very dark about this, dying for it, from our weekends, from the 8-hour workday, from our minimum wages, all of these kinds of things. I mean, one of the big movements in the 1900s was the 8-hour workday.
But you're looking at the big leaps that have been made, and not the sort of the gradual incremental progress that always happens in terms of like job comfort.
Let's say
even a bus driver. Like, if you look at how comfortable a bus is now for a bus driver compared to how comfortable it was 30 years ago, a bus driver is much happier today because he's in a much more comfortable.
So tell me about
that's so relative.
Tell me, but but I'll agree with that.
But my point is
but tell me about the work of transport unions.
What do you want to know?
What you think bosses went, I just feel like this worker needs a more expensive seat to sit in so he can be comfortable? No, obviously not. It was workers banding together and going, this is bullshit. I want a better seat to sit in for 8 hours while I complete my drive.
I think it was probably more a case of bus manufacturers competing to have the best product available for bus companies to buy.
I think that's a very naive way to look at it. I think no. I mean, okay, I can agree with you to the extent that, yes, competition within bus manufacturers were like, okay, this is where the market is going. But I'd say the reason the market was heading for that is because people doing the actual work were like, we want better work conditions. This is bullshit. We're not going to do this work unless we have those. And this is the historical reality of labor and union struggles.
But do you think that computers get faster because people who work with computers are constantly lobbying their bosses for faster computers?
No, I think computers get faster because people working on computers are actually passionate about passionate about working within that technology. And that's actually an argument against capitalism, because that passion is always there, whether or not you're rewarded for it.
Right, but what I'm saying is
doctors want to save their patients no matter how much they're getting paid. Okay, I'd rather maybe go to a better paid doctor, but at the end of the day, people don't go into doctors because they're like, oh, I don't want to save lives. So this is for me a fundamental argument about this idea that we need something external to us, and this is why I think a market, liberal philosophy or liberal politics is inherently authoritarian. It's because there is that idea that we need something external to us to help to tell us how to behave, and that in our liberal world is the market.
Why do you think left-wing politics like communism has never been successful?
No, that's a really good question. Do you want to take a specific historical example?
No, just very general.
so I think
unless there's one that you specifically wish to highlight.
I think that's a very good question. Wait, let me do this.
Thank you.
I think that's a really good question, and that's something that a lot of leftists fail to do. And one of the reason why, and again, I'm using leftist here in my perspective. I'll have a top up as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Since we're about to jump into communist history.
Failures of communism. We've only got how many hours? Right.
No, I think it's a really valid point. So the first thing to go to is, how do you want to define communism? So if you want to define them based on, the abolition of private property in the state, then the argument that, none of it was real communism is quite present. And here's a historic lesson. So I think a lot of people think that term, it wasn't real communism, comes from kind of reactionary communists trying to defend the Soviet Union or whatever kind of revolution, or Chinese revolution or whatever. But it is actually inherent to Leninist ideology, especially. So Lenin, when he wrote The State and Revolution, which he wrote as the Russian Revolution was happening, he actually ends it kind of and by the way, again, for the record, I am not a Leninist.
Tell the folks at home who Lenin was.
But he ends the book kind of in a way where he goes, I can write more, but I'd rather participate in history as it's happening. So it's just kind of like a cool historic thing. So in that book, he specifically talks about a two-stage communism, where one he calls state capitalism, and then two, he goes full communism. So even by Lenin, who initiated the first workers' state, it wasn't.
So as I understand
communism.
Leninism, it's the idea that you initially have the state wrest control of everything, restructure everything, and then once this new structure has been set and everybody's cool with it, the state kind of like diminishes into the background.
It'll wither away. That's the state, that's the word they like to use. So Trotsky says this as well. So the fastest way to dissolve the state is through the highest intensification of the state. I think it's a completely like defunct way of looking at things.
What was that Trotsky quote? What are you doing with that ice pick?
I mean, but here's the interesting thing, that as much as you and I can sit here and think that these guys were ridiculous authoritarians, Stalin came along and Trotsky thought he was a ridiculous authoritarian. So I mean, I think these are funny things to say, but they give you kind of an insight into how a term such as Marxism can be, or communism can be, switched into anything, and a lot of the contemporary issues now around Venezuela. Oh, look at Venezuela, socialism. And my question is always, what makes Venezuela socialist? I mean, private property is still there. The state is very much there. They've nationalized some of their industries, including oil, but that's no different than some of your Nordic countries.
Are there societies in history that actually did manage to abolish private property?
So
Yes.
The closest thing that comes to it, and in terms of relevancy today, a lot of people point to the Cuban Revolution.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I would have said Sparta.
Sparta.
Yeah, but that's
That was like a
that's,
totalitarian.
yeah, that is super.
But
An older example would be the CNT in Spain. They were more anarcho-syndicalists. And they're a very
why don't you tell the folks at
interesting-
home what anarcho-syndicalist means?
Yes, that is. So anarcho-syndicalism is kind of a how do I even describe this? So it's the idea that your economy should be structured based on industrial syndicates.
Mm-hmm.
That's the word. Instead of having a centralized state deciding this is how many toothbrushes we need to make, you have the syndicalist of toothbrush makers or whatever, and then you have these kind of different verticals that operate in a democratic market way that allows the needs of production to be met. So in Spain, the CNT was actually very successful at doing this, ironically, until they were kind of stabbed in the back by Stalinists, and then fascism won over. So so again, this idea that not all Marxists are the same and communism is not one thing. The same thing, the same thing can be said of liberalism or
Christianity.
classical liberalism. Yeah,
I mean, like, someone who only celebrates Easter and Christmas is not the same as the Westboro Baptist Church.
right, yeah.
Right. So sometimes I think the article that you mentioned earlier that I wrote, one of the issues that I was trying to pick on at that is that sometimes we use a label to describe a group or an idea, and that label can be so broadly encompassing that it actually hides so much detail, and the devil is in the detail. And if you want to use that Christian example
This
again,
is the good devil we're talking about.
a typical Anglican is not the same thing as the Westboro Baptist Church, but both are nominally Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, I mean, it's the same thing. I think to bring that into contemporary relevance, this idea of immigration and Islam, it's like, I've shared more drinks with Muslims when I was in Lebanon, at least, than I did with Christians, because that's just my social circle. And, okay, my friends who are Muslim would maybe fast on Ramadan and pray every once in a while, and that for them was being Islam. And then you have people anyone who deviates from my orthodox interpretation of the text needs to get their head chopped off.
Yeah.
I just realized every time I'm on a podcast I'm talking about someone being chopped off. It's not
Oh really? Is that right?
So
that's like 7 now, isn't it?
so obviously
it's kind of his thing.
So obviously these are not the same, these are not the same things.
Yeah, of course.
And it's so crazy to see, people talk about it as if it were.
Yeah.
And when, you just do a small litmus test on whether or not you consider yourself a Christian and how Christian are you, the degree of your Christianity, and then again what type of Christian and whatever, all these subgroups and subdivisions. It goes back to what Gavin was saying. It's mostly a socialized kind of identifier more than anything else.
Yeah. What Liz, I'm keen to kind of switch gears a little bit. What do you guys think about the rise of the sort of social political YouTube influencers and alternative news outlets? Like your InfoWars, Breitbart, even Sputnik, Russia Today type stuff. What are your thoughts?
I have a mixed view about it. Centrist.
Yeah, surprise.
Such a Gemini. And it's so on one side, I want there to be this free market of ideas, as it's called. I want there to be as many ideas proposed as possible, and people can really pick and choose and dissect and assimilate and chew up and do whatever with all the information they can.
Sure.
I think that will lead to people having a more realistic and holistic view of the world around them.
Yeah.
On the other side, though, we realize that people are so naturally hardwired to things like outrage, to catchy headlines, to even reading the headline and not paying attention to the detail of the story, which is, I think, become very common very recently. And it's very easy to create bandwagons and witch hunts and all these things. And so
Witch hunts. We're going down that road, aren't we?
well, I'm just saying that I think, and again, like if I was ever to try and propose a change, my changes are usually sort of towards the culture. I would implore people to start being more responsible about how they consume information.
Sounds a bit
more
like,
critical about the things.
sounds a bit like you're telling people how to behave. Or how they
Imploring
should
them.
behave.
But like,
Just,
it's not that bad to say be smarter.
oh no, but how are you gonna measure that? I mean, that's not even gonna get into that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great thing. I think there's a Rosa Luxemburg quote I like, that if democracy starts to be the thorn in the side of the elite, then we should push for more of it. I mean, that's a paraphrase. That's not exactly what it is, but it's something to that effect.
Nothing like that.
It's something completely different. I just made that up. I don't even know who Rosa Luxemburg is. It's I think it's great. I mean, we wouldn't have been able to start Reformer if it wasn't for this.
Yes.
I think what we need to look at is the overarching reason why outrage culture is, becoming such a thing,
Great question.
so out there. I mean, for me, there's kind of two reasons. One more superficial, which is just it pays the bills. It's people are drawn to it. They don't need to think about it. They find something that agrees to whatever conception they have and go, yeah, this is right. It's all immigrants' fault, or it's all.
That's from a consumer's perspective.
Yeah.
But from a creator's perspective, they're doing it purely for presumably financial gain, and they can do that.
I mean, they can do that, and that's fine. I mean, here we get to the point where are we incentivizing outrage, which I think we are.
Definitely.
We are, absolutely.
Yeah.
And part of the problem with that, though, is that a fundamental, a free press is a fundamental foundation stone of democracy. And what we have is a technically free press, but it's not a free press that represents information accurately to people.
You sound like a communist.
And I think it's a problem that we need to work out, is that although we have this free information that we're all available to consume, or that we're all, we all may consume, it's never the accurate picture.
Well, I mean, I'd argue, can it ever be the accurate picture?
Yeah, it's all
Well,
perspective.
but you can advocate, or you can aim for an honest journalism at least, and we don't even get honest journalism. We
Yeah,
get
but why would you
journalism.
when the objective of any institution under our current form is to maximize profit?
No, because that assumes that the consumers don't want honest journalism.
They don't. They're obviously consuming and they have no problem.
Well, in that case, then, going back to what I said earlier about the cultural change, what we need to do is implore individuals to say, be more sensible about the media you consume, and the market will take care of it.
How do you empower them? How do you empower them, or implore them, or whatever?
Well, that happens through dialogue, through individuals kind of making this point and it, falling on the ears of others, and them saying, actually, yeah, I think that's a good idea, and it happening, and it's. But it's.
I think there are a lot stronger forces in our society that are moving us away from that.
Such as.
Well, capitalism. But my point is the second underlying and I think more important thing to this is why we are being attracted to outrage culture falls exactly to what your point is that this idea that everything needs to be social and everything needs to be through discourse. I mean, what happened to the liberal that just wants to be left alone? See, so that's kind of my argument, is I think people should be left alone to make their own things, and I don't want to put some kind of overarching you should be smarter, because that's kind of an elitist argument to begin with.
Take a drink every time Jade says overarching.
You prole, you should be smarter, you shouldn't vote because you're an idiot. I mean, and people make that argument at the end of the day, and I think that's kind of an elitist and kind of eventually authoritarian argument. So for me, the idea is that the way we do politics and the way politics is structured also pushes us towards that kind of consumerist, superficial engagement with us, because most of us are busy trying to, keep a roof over our head, get food, buy maybe a car, maybe buy a house. I don't know how many people now are actually thinking about that or can afford that.
Get the latest Drake album.
Yes. It's our musical break. I lost my train of thought.
Good.
Yes. So wait. So because politics, the way we engage with politics is this: every once in 4 years we go tick a box on a piece of paper. Then we are looking for all these other outlets. So for me, the reason why we're also looking towards outrage culture or outrage type of news, or are attracted to it, is because we don't have the means to engage with politics in a more meaningful and impactful way.
Right, and it's something we don't have. I mean, the US used to have it. I don't think they have it now, and we don't have in the UK. There's no sense of like civics class or anything. Nobody teaches you how to be a civic.
I think we're going back to education here. I mean, the example I like to use more is Switzerland. So Switzerland has a referendum system. Every law goes through a referendum. If it's something that needs to be, changes the constitution, it needs to do something called the double majority. So where there is a simple majority, most of the population needs to vote for it, and the majority of the cantons, I think there's 27 of them, need to also vote in favor of it. And what studies have shown is because of this system, people do vote for the things that they think impact them. They don't vote for the things that they think won't impact them, or they don't really care for them. And because of that, people who usually vote are more competent and are more informed, because they are seeking out the news sources that show them, both sides, that show them a more, balanced approach, etc., and all of that. So I think that's a really important kind of thing to understand within the structure of politics, is that right now people, are forced to not really care about politics because they're busy living their lives, or there's this, ideological component where, well, I should just care about me. Politics isn't going to impact me, whatever, because that is something people can afford to do at a certain economic strata.
Yeah.
And then the only way to get involved in politics is every 4 years cast a ballot.
Yeah.
So politics itself is a very alienated kind of body. It becomes so distant from your day-to-day structurally.
I'm going to read you a tweet. This was yesterday, actually. It was a guy.
I love tweets.
It came up on my feed, and I just thought it was really interesting. The person, his name's Geraint Edwards, Geraint 1982. He says, "I find it very difficult to remain friends with people once I've found out they vote Tory. It's my view that they either don't care or are unwilling to listen to reason. So, am I being unreasonable, or, in brackets, poll question, close bracket, is it impossible to be friends with a Tory?"
Did someone tweet this to you, or is this just a random tweet?
That was a tweet. It was, so there was a vote, yes or no, and it had like over
so it's just a random tweet.
200 retweets. Yeah, at least. Like it had furious engagement, and people were wading in on their view. Like, why? I mean, I think that's ludicrous. Why is politics so divisive?
May I?
Yeah, go for it.
So, one of the TED Talk ideas that I had kind of bounced around with Jade was the four letter words beginning with C, and conservatism being one of them, centrism being another one, capitalism being another one.
Okay, I need to interrupt. I just need to interrupt because it's really funny how this kind of victimhood of it's so bad being a conservative, but they've been in power in the UK for the past 3 runnings, 3 elections.
What you have there is a person who is a conservative saying that,
but that's one person. You can't. Conservatives have literally been in power for the last 10 years.
That's because the alternative is Jeremy Corbyn.
I mean, fine. I'm not going to get into that. I'm not going to get into that. But this idea that conservatives are some kind of hunted minority who are having to hide in the woods.
No.
But bullshit.
There's a sort of implied assumption with conservatism that if you are the sort of person who votes conservative, you're a bad person. You're morally defunct. You don't have the same virtues that somebody more liberal, like an SNP voter in the UK or
what happened
Labour
to the
voter.
freedom of ideas? I'm free to hold that idea.
Yeah, but if everybody holds that idea, then someone who does identify as conservative is going to feel very alienated and isolated from the people around them. They're going to feel persecuted. There's a really interesting book on this called
Sounds like you want a safe space.
I'm not a conservative, by the way.
No, I'm
just very quickly, who would you vote for tomorrow if there was an election?
I don't see. I would typically vote Liberal Democrat.
Right.
However, the Liberal Democrats have just become a chocolate teapot.
Yeah.
And I completely need to re-evaluate the British political scene at the moment, which I haven't really spent time doing.
Could you vote UKIP?
Could I?
Could you fathom?
Honestly, I would need to think about it a lot. I mean, so for me, it's not just about policy and stuff. It's also about my entire friend group, social group, people who I love. Almost all of them are from outside the UK.
Okay.
And if I was to support a party whose fundamental stance is nationalism, that wouldn't feel right to me. It would be sending out the wrong message to them. So even without looking at the policy, I think I would say no.
Gav wants me closer to him.
Yeah, but where was I going with this? Yeah, so I'm not a conservative voter. I've never actually voted conservative, but The Righteous Mind, a book by Jonathan Haidt. He looks into he's a psychologist, and he's looking into the
great book, yeah.
Kind of what makes up the moral fibers of people who identify with different social demographics, different cohorts, and he just shows that basically the way that people who identify as conservative interpret the world through a moral lens is very different from how people identify it in a sort of liberal sense. They have extra facets to it, and that's just scratching the surface of what it means to be a conservative in the UK. There's this fiscal conservatism where you care more about, or you worry more about the economy and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The idea that you will demonize a person because they identify with conservative values is, to me, just idiotic.
It is, but that's is exactly what's happened.
I'm
It's
going to
become
come on from the other
to-
side.
Tory has become a pejorative term.
Yes,
You know?
absolutely.
Yeah.
And when did that happen?
Well,
but
I think
there
it
are some
happened-
absolute pricks within the Tory party as well.
Sure.
You've got
No,
Yeah,
I think
I'm not
it
I'm
happens
not-
when your party stands. Okay, so I'm from the essence that it's very hard to differentiate between the personal and the political, right? I think the act of life itself is a political act, right? How you choose to interact with other people, that's a political act. What you think should happen with our resources, that's a political act, right? If your entire being is summed up by a political view that, you know, is all about cutting social aid, cutting wealth distribution, things like that, and I'm arguing from a liberal perspective here, I think I can find it very easily how someone goes, oh, you don't care about poor people, you're a shitty person.
right, and you got people like Ian Duncan Smith, who he was challenged to live on £52 a week or however much it was, and he said, I could do that, and people said, I think there was a petition for people signed for him to actually do it, and he refused to because the guy's a millionaire.
What's this? That's like a tweet, a meme that keeps going around. Put the politicians on minimum wage and see how fast things change.
That's brilliant.
Yeah, so
That's
you know
awesome.
there is a truth to it. You know, it's if your politics completely revolve around, I mean, I'm not saying this is a conservative in the UK sense, but I'm saying conservative in the theoretical idea that genderqueer people shouldn't exist. I think that's a pretty shitty stance to hold.
Yeah.
I understand that's not identified with conservatism
Sure.
in the politics,
Yeah.
but I wrote an article about conservatism against conservatism. I mean, it is the theory that sole historical role was to stand in the way of progress. Like, that is by definition what being a conservative is.
So I look at it in a slightly different sense.
To change.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with that in a sense, but for me, working in tech, we have a thing called the adoption curve, where it's literally like a bell-shaped curve, and it maps how quickly people will adopt new technology. And you still have people who are using Internet Explorer 6 on their 1998 PC,
Really?
Probably.
Hi, Grandma.
And I think I kind of view politics in that sense as well, that new ideas can enter this sort of social sphere, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to take on a new idea immediately, and you might just not have the appetite, or you might not have the energy to change how you perceive the world. Tends to be more older people who find it more challenging to
Yes.
update their worldview versus young
Yes.
people. So this idea that just because a new idea has been proposed, you don't have to take it up right away. And the people who do take it up right away are the progressive ones, because they're progressing with this new idea.
I think there's...
It's a temperament thing, though.
Yeah, I also think we are falling into this fallacy of seeing people as politically engaged and, come up with their own political ideas. I think the biggest indicator of how people vote is still like 70% what their parents voted.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there is a large socialized
Hi,
element
Dad.
to it. There is a large socialized element to it. So I think it's interesting. And one of my biggest fear, and this goes back to your question of like how I got into politics, or how I shaped my kind of worldview. So I grew up in a generally leftist household. Well, I mean, at least my dad claims to be. I don't at this stage think he is. Like, I think I'm a lot further left than he is. I think he's just mostly an authoritarian. But anyway.
Further left than anybody?
Hi, Dad. But it's that's something that I really fear, is that am I just a leftist because of my family
Probably.
history? But
Do you fear that?
it is a fear. Has my entire worldview just been a confirmation bias of what I grew up around? And I mean, I don't know. It's scary to think that.
Can I get a bit Jordan Peterson for a second?
Go for it.
So
You're gonna love this. I for one actually like Jordan Peterson. So
I've been to see him talk. It was quite a good talk. I think that
How
an
much
important
did he
part
fleece you for?
those tickets were pricey.
an important part of an individual's journey could be sort of mapped against this hero's journey thing, where I think you need to leave your home, which is part of the hero's journey. You need to go into the abyss, and you need to come back as a newly formed person with the new thing that you've learned. And I think you can do that in the sense of your political development, where you need to kind of leave the nest. You need to detach yourself from your parents.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, I don't think I hold the same political views as my parents.
No. But so one of my favorite philosophers is a guy named Max Stirner. And Max Stirner's kind of main idea, I mean, this guy was so feared by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels that they wrote a book kind of warning people not to read his stuff. But his whole thing was that people will fill your head with ideas. He called them ghosts. And you're constantly having your head filled with ghosts by other people, and they're all just ghosts. You need to just get rid of them all. And I think that for any person to become a sort of well-rounded and engaged adult, you need to detach yourself from the ghosts that you've had put in your head as a youngster. Go out and completely find your own new thing and come back.
I'm going to clarify, a bit as a Marxist about that, why Engels and Marx kind of warned of Stirner, and this is kind of a long-running thing between Marxism and existentialism, because I'm also very interested in existentialism. It's this idea that, it's what we were talking about earlier. It's this idea that you can completely detach yourself from your material surroundings. So Stirner is obviously very much an advocate of that. The self exists from within, blah, 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 whatever. You don't need to worry about all of that. But obviously, if I'm someone who, can't afford, I'm worried about how I'm going to pay rent the next month, my psyche is very different than, I want to be an individual and a free-thinking individual. Sure. So,
and we can go Abraham Maslow on this if you want.
Yeah, and this is why, Marx and Engels, I mean, I wouldn't use the term we're afraid of him, but we're warning against this kind of philosophy that puts forth the individual. I don't want to say individual over the collective, but the idea that the individual can be detached from their material surroundings.
But so Stirner used the word ghost specifically because the Communist Manifesto opens with the line, there's a ghost kind of moving across Europe.
There's a spectre is haunting Europe.
Yeah, and so he chose the word ghost to represent the stupid ideas people will put in your head.
Here's a fun other translation. So from German, it doesn't translate into ghost. It actually, but it translates more into like a hobgoblin. So the proper translation would have been a hobgoblin.
A trokolosh.
So fun facts with Jade.
I've got another tweet for you guys.
All right.
This is a woman called Melissa Chen. This one was a little while ago. I'm a centrist. I hold some conservative views and some liberal views, but I'm more afraid of talking to my liberal friends about my conservative views than I am talking to my conservative friends about my liberal views.
I can totally identify with that.
Yeah.
I find that.
Why do you think that is?
I find that currently, anyway, people who are on the, and I hate these terms, but people on the kind of left liberal thing, there's this inherent morality to their stance. And that's not really there in the same way. Okay, it is there in the sense of religion and stuff with conservatism, but there's not the same sort of desperate need to show yourself as a virtuous, Übermensch. It's more just, I'm a person and here are my views. And so
I would refute that.
Oh,
surprise!
There's a surprise.
Well, it's not, because you also have equally this identity and moral politics of the right, where look at these snowflakes. It's like
not in the UK though.
I mean, I don't know. I haven't been living there, but I'm talking about, since we're on the topic of outrage culture, this idea that I'm outraged by the fact that these people are outraged. You end up in this kind of like completely, opposing circles where both of these stances are completely defunct of anything of substance, and completely survive on the idea of hating the other.
If everyone's outraged, nobody's outraged.
So it's like it's really this weird like balance where okay, and you know, going back to this you know, Sargon, Peterson, and all of these people. I mean,
Love
fine.
those guys.
Peterson is a psychologist, but his politics completely depend on this idea of you know, what in kind of Lacanian psychoanalysis is called the big other. You know, this idea that my identity only exists as a mirror image or in opposition of this big other, which is liberal, left, right, whatever you fall on. You know, you have those gun-toting, hardcore, you know, pry the gun from my cold dead hands, you know, kind of people. Like, that exists on both sides. Now I'm the centrist. But that's why both sides need to be destroyed. I needed to fix that, so I'm not a centrist. And you know, we need to get out of this, you know, tit for tat, socialized politics kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree that there really is the sense of being. I mean,
I just need a disclaimer. This is starting to hit me.
Oh, yeah. I'm getting lower and lower in my chair.
You're more and more
slurring my speech.
When Jade pulls out his soapbox, that's when we should kill the cameras.
Too late.
No, I mean, I think the point where I did start to just disengage with social political stuff was when I realized that I was getting caught up in the outrage of outrage, where, you know, someone is outraged at a thing and I'm like, why are you outraged at that? That's outrageous. and
it's so easy to fall into that, especially online. And because that is, again, I go back to the point that we are not engaging with our communities. We are not engaging with people. We are engaging with these abstractions of abstractions online that, oh, look at this article. This woman somewhere, you know, God knows where, said something that is never in a million years going to impact me. How stupid is that? That is outrageous. And it's like,
I mean, looking through my Facebook feed, the town I'm from is Kirkcaldy. Kirkcaldy has some areas that are kind of in the lowest demographics of the poverty metric that they use in Scotland. And, you know, last week or the last 2 weeks, there was more people talking about the Gillette ad than there were about the fact that, you know, areas of their hometown are in the lowest of the low. And that was what I was talking about earlier with the kind of the material issues that just aren't talked about because we have this layer of noise above us being constantly rammed down our throat, constantly sold to us.
Well, I think it's that, but I also think it also points to the impotence of our political system, is that they've tried and they've given up. And now the only thing to keep them entertained or occupied is this way of engaging with politics.
Do you think that's the political system or the media?
No, I mean, it's very hard to say the media. I mean, going back to the media should be free. The media should be able to say, you know, freedom of speech and all of that kind of stuff. So I would go into the structural issues because everything else is just social. And again, the structural perspective on the media is that, well, they're here to make money. So why wouldn't they take the, you know,
easy
path of least resistance and go towards outrage culture?
But on the subject of outrage, to be a centrist, to offer a sort of the other side of the view.
Argument.
Outrage is what drives a lot of political progress.
Okay.
As in, you have to point out an issue, create awareness of it, hopefully outrage, and then advocate for change of said issue. I think what's happening is, at the moment, we're having so much of it rammed down our throat. We're told to be outraged by everything, and that it's not all... it doesn't always have the magnitude that it deserves. So it's very skewed.
I mean, this is where I'd also come in, not opposed to that, but I'd counter the idea that we're having it shoved down our throats. Again, choosing
it's constantly available to us.
Yes, choosing to engage with that content is completely an individual choice.
Sure.
I'm always for the idea that, no, go out there, engage with your community, you know, be that through a political party, or be that through a union, or be that through whatever way that can actually actualize change, and you know, go for it. Because that, you know, as long as you are, you know, going back to what I said, your route to change is through politics, is through engaging with change, not going, oh, none of this matters, I'm just going to live my life. Because you might be able to do that for a while, but then someday might come where you lose your job, you're suddenly, in debt, you have a mortgage, you're trying to pay off a car, whatever, I mean, we're also talking from a Scottish perspective where healthcare is, afforded to us. We completely don't have to worry about that, including prescription, which I was blown away the first time I had to use that, because we don't even have that in Canada.
How is the rash?
It's great. Still dealing with a bit of Gavin.
What are your guys' views on things like freedom of speech? And to anyone watching or listening, I'll use the example of Count Dankula. Marcus Meekin, who made a video about teaching his pug dog kind of Nazi salutes and the like. But, so within the context of it, he opens up the video and says, my girlfriend thinks my girlfriend thinks her dog, this pug, Buddha, is super cute. So I'm going to try and turn it into the most vile thing that I can think of, which is a Nazi, as a joke. And then he gets Buddha to respond to things like gas the Jews and Zekiel. Like, he was arrested for that, and he was found guilty of, I think it was, I guess, like a hate crime or whatever it was.
It was committing gross offence on electronic transmission or something like that.
That's the one.
And he paid the fine.
He didn't pay it. He was fined £800 and he didn't pay it. He then started a crowdfunding campaign in order to pay to cover legal fees to get the whole thing overturned, and raised like 140 grand.
So he's going through an appeal process.
Yes.
Okay.
So if you don't mind, I'll pick this one up because I'm on public record on this one. I wrote a letter to my MP about that particular issue.
Did you really?
I did. And my stance at the time was, I mean, I've seen a few of his YouTube videos. I think he's a bit of a tit.
Really?
Like, I'm not a huge fan of him as a person.
Really?
But,
I shouldn't sound so surprised at that, but, I quite like it.
But I recognised that it was done in jest. It wasn't a sincere expression of his views or anything like that. And it was just an idiot doing something idiotic, and I didn't think that it warranted a criminal prosecution. And so I wrote to my MP basically saying that imploring how this law is being used at the moment is completely inappropriate. And I actually obviously there's a very anti-Semitic tone to what he did. It was a Jewish friend of mine that kind of re-syndicated my letter and supported it. So it was that was helpful because of obviously the sensitivity of the issue.
Yes.
It's like, for me, I'm effectively a freedom of speech fundamentalist, or absolutist, in the sense that, I mean, people always say, what about someone shouting fire in a theatre? If you were in a theatre and someone shouted fire, you would look around and you would say, you wouldn't instantly stampede and
no.
So I think there's always a stupid example that people bring up, right? But that's, I mean, people always say that
I think that's used as an example because in US law, that is one of the things that is not covered under free speech, and that's why it's become such like a popular go-to catchphrase.
Yeah,
I mean, I think it's interesting because this idea
when you say it's not covered under free speech,
I think that comes under some form of incitement.
Yeah.
So can you be prosecuted for it?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that would be an incitement to a riot or incitement, something like that.
Oh. Yeah. So, and I think that's the thing about free speech. It is a very abstract concept, and legally it exists mostly in the US. In the UK and in Canada, for example, it doesn't really exist in the way that it does in the US. I don't, the funny thing about all of these people who are arguing for free speech and all of that, and I keep saying this, is no one is stopping them from what they're saying.
Yeah.
What they're more concerned about is the way people are reacting to what they're saying.
Exactly.
So it gets to the stage where in Ontario recently there was a free speech law passed that stops people from protesting and being disruptive or blocking entry into specific spaces. So it was as a reply to people in universities shutting down events or no platforming. And I think no platforming is a really interesting topic to explore, especially from a liberal perspective, the idea of free speech versus no platforming. So no platforming isn't that people shouldn't be allowed to say what they want to say. It's that why are private institutions allowing these people to say many times they're really backwards and unappealing and unscientific things. So I think that's the important thing, is why are private universities, private venues going to host these people? I mean, at the end of the day, it's a moral argument. I don't really agree with it. But free speech itself becomes a very kind of abstract kind of thing. You have the right to say whatever you want. Mm-hmm. I might punch you in the face for it. I'll be prosecuted for assault.
Yeah.
But, it's up to your, you still said it. You still have the freedom to say whatever it is.
Yeah.
I mean, do I think someone teaching their pug to Heil Hitler or whatever should be prosecuted by law? I think that's a misuse of resources.
Yeah.
But I think the way we want to look at this larger free speech argument is, really take it down to the nuts and bolts. Are people really being stopped from saying things, or are they being countered and even at times being stopped?
Well, there are criminal prosecutions happening in the UK reasonably regularly now for people saying things online.
Yeah.
And it's, from what I gather, it's people saying hateful things towards certain groups.
So this is a policy issue. This isn't an abstract free speech issue. So this is my problem with these types of debates. So materially, what is it that we're looking to change? We can sit here and talk about free speech all day, but there needs to be some kind of legal parameter for what it is. And,
so
right now there isn't in the UK.
I had a bit of so I was part of the Scottish Secular Society for a little while, and I'm still kind of connected with a bunch of the secularists, and I had a bit of a misunderstanding with one of the members of the society, because he had shared a post, I think it was in Canada, where people had petitioned and gone through the kind of legal machinery and all the organs and whatnot to have blasphemy laws relaxed. And I kind of made the comment of, there's something that really irks me about having to ask for permission to blaspheme.
Right.
And that's a very sort of Max Stirner thing again. It's the idea that if you have
very revolutionary.
It's the idea if you have to ask for for permission to do something, then it's not a freedom, it's a permission. It's something that they can give to you and take away from you.
But that's what laws are. That is the function of laws, to determine what is permissible and what isn't.
But when it's something as fundamental as like what comes out of your mouth.
Yeah, but there's nothing fundamental. Like, that's the whole idea of law. Think about gay rights, right? Like, we now think of it as a fundamental right. And that's the thing about universal human rights, is that there was never a point in history where they were universal.
No, they still aren't.
Yeah. So this is why I have this problem with these abstract concepts. And then going back to this idea of freedom of speech, the idea of legal freedom of speech is to protect people, and going again the fundamental principle of a freedom of principle of a freedom of press. This is really hitting me. is the idea that to protect individuals from attacking the state. So I can't go. Well, actually, in the UK, maybe I can be arrested for this if I go, the Queen is crap.
The Queen's rubbish.
Let's find out.
When's your flight?
Today on Will Jade will get arrested. See, so it's that kind of idea. It's a power dynamic. It's not something to manage interpersonal relationship. So where in the UK, to protect minority groups, someone is inciting, all Muslims are horrible, we shouldn't let them into the country, and then I'm not going to go on to more intense kind of things, then that is fundamentally what the law is supposed to do. It's to manage the relationship between individuals. And that goes to your opening point about the law needs to manage making sure, people aren't at each other's throats and things like that.
Yeah.
So it becomes a grey area.
And I don't disagree with incitement laws, to be fair.
Yeah. But there also seems to be this false labeling of certain people as well. So basically, if you have an idea that even remotely deviates from the sort of norm, you're immediately like radical leftist or alt-right.
So if you're not a centrist?
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I sit in the centre because if you're in the centre, everybody likes you. Right?
Yeah. Well, in theory. But like in the case of Count Dankula and Sargon of Akkad. So anyone who doesn't know Sargon of Akkad, his name's Karl Benjamin. He's a YouTuber. He's got over 900,000 subscribers. People say that he's an anti-feminist. He attacked one specific person around the sort of Gamergate scandal. Anita Sarkeesian
I don't
was
know
her
what
name.
either
And
of
she,
these things are.
yeah, you need to look into it. There's like a rabbit hole of things
See, but
that
that's
you
the
need to
thing.
kind of
It
look
is
into.
a rabbit hole, and
It
this
is a rabbit
goes
hole.
back to the outrage concept.
Yeah, but but yes, I get that. But there's more fundamental issues. So, for example, I had invited Sargon Karl up to do an interview, and so he wanted he was looking at potentially at the same time organising an event. I don't know if I told you guys this. He was looking to organise an event, and so I was in discussions with his assistant, if you like, and it was like they were looking for an event venue, and I was to try and maybe think of some ideas. It's like, how many people do you estimate? Well, there's not that much of a UKIP following in Scotland, so maybe under 100. And I was like, right, okay. He was like, we'll get Sargon, like Karl, and Count Dankula in one room to do a sort of
big thing.
Well, I mean, a kind of UKIP,
Yeah.
semi-UKIP rally, I guess. And
Are you endorsing UKIP?
they haven't. I'm not. But look, if I went, I was in. No, hold a second. I was invited along to go to the event for free, but by going along, I would be implicitly advocating or supporting UKIP. You know, I would imagine, but they haven't been able to get a venue for it. And it's like...
So are you saying they're not being able to get a venue because of their political views?
Exactly what I'm saying. Yeah.
But do we know that?
Yeah, well, why else are they not able to get a venue? It's not just because all the venues are taken.
Okay.
Plenty of
It's
pubs in Edinburgh.
specifically because
So we know that it's not a
having
capacity
difficult
thing, is what I'm saying.
So
Yeah, yeah.
UKIP has now seemingly become an extremist party that has people like Tommy Robinson acting as an advisor. I've listened extensively to like Tommy Robinson stuff, and I'm not supporting Tommy Robinson. I'm not advocating what he says, does, breathes, whatever. You know, he had done things when he was a leader of the EDL and part of other groups, and he's now still a part. He's connected to Pegida and all this stuff. He's anti-Islam. That's firmly his stance, because he believes that Islam is a violent religion, that Prophet Muhammad supports pedophilia and like all this stuff.
Yeah, the
right?
typical.
That's what he believes.
Right.
And you know, in my personal opinion, he's entitled to his own views. He's not trying to impose them on me.
Right.
He can think whatever he wants.
Okay.
I don't intend to then label him as something that he isn't. For
Which
example,
is what?
well, politically, I don't
Yeah.
believe that he is alt-right. I believe he has extreme views,
Okay.
perhaps around a certain topic.
Okay.
In the same way that Sargon, who's a centrist, is alt-right,
Yeah.
and
Yeah, the
Paul
alt-right's a
Joseph
very
Watson is
specific thing.
alt-right,
I mean, I
and
hate-
Count Dankula is alt-right, and those guys have all become members or affiliates with UKIP, and as a byproduct of that, UKIP is now ostensibly an alt-right party. Like, where do you draw the line?
So
here?
there's two things here. One, the fact that private institutions are denying to host this event. They have the freedom to do that, right? So, and the second thing, I hate the term alt-right. One, because it almost means nothing, and two, because it was first coined by Richard Spencer.
Yeah, I mean, to me, alt-right only
I
really
don't-
defines the kind of Richard Spencer rights, the kind of the guys with the...
I mean, I wouldn't, someone who's going, all Muslims believe in pedophilia or something to that extent, that's definitely is it an alt-right view? That's definitely an illiberal viewpoint. And for me, that's something to be fought against as a liberal, not even I'm using liberal here in the terms of, live and let live kind of thing, because this is someone who's going to actively be fighting against the right of other people to hold their beliefs, or to hold their beliefs next to them. And I think that's absolute bull. Like, that's just not, I mean, that's exactly the same thing you were talking about, this, conservatives being some kind of, that's that exact argument. I have no time to kind of tolerate or accept other people who find the existence of others offensive.
Yeah, I'll second that.
The existence of others. But it's not necessarily the existence of others.
The existence of others next to me.
No, it's But it's not. It's specifically to do with it's
something you're born
people,
into.
No, I think it goes back to what I
so-
said earlier about when a label becomes so all-encompassing that it describes a whole multitude of different types of
exactly.
people.
Yes.
And when you just dismiss that everything under that label
Yeah.
as being bad or wrong or
Yeah.
anything, then you're guilty of misthink in a very bad way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so myopic on the part of the people that are labeling.
Hmm.
You know, it's not seeing the full picture.
Yeah.
And so, I would be concerned about going along to said event in case I was suddenly branded as frickin' alt-right when I know I'm not. You know?
Well,
What does alt-right
then
even
why
mean,
would you
though?
go? What does life mean? What is?
I mean,
In the
for
same
me-
way that why would I sit here and have a conversation with a Marxist if I'm not a Marxist?
No,
that's a very good point.
That's such a short-sighted
not-
way of
that's
looking
not-
at
I
it.
never
Yes.
even thought about that. I've been hanging out with
Because
this guy for
I'm,
ages.
but that's
I
the
didn't
truth.
think about that at all.
By,
You're
you know,
all Marxists now.
By that,
That was my trick. I've been
exactly,
foiled.
but that's it. By that limited logic, I'm a Marxist.
No,
Yeah.
but it's
Shit, man.
but it's
My
what do you
name's next to this guy.
what do you find appealing about going to see in that event?
It's not about whether it's appealing or not. It's the fact that I've been invited to go to it, and I'm open
I mean, what,
to
if you're
listening
invited to like
to Ku Klux Klan meeting.
yeah,
Yeah,
Like,
let's go.
I mean, if you're invited to where we're sacrificing a child to the sun god, and I was invited, I'm gonna go.
Well,
I mean,
purely,
there's some things you'd want to see,
purely
right?
out of interest. So I believe in
So it's a
challenging
curiosity
my own.
thing.
No, hold on a second. Don't put words into my
Okay.
mouth. I am somebody that makes my own personal views and opinions based on a full set of evidence,
Yeah.
facts.
You want
anything.
the smorgasbord?
I'm entirely I can be objective about things and detach myself emotionally from things, and I like to be able to make opinions based on full information. So by not going to it, what's that saying? That I'm against it? Well, I'm not against it. I'm open to anything. So by that
Yeah, then go.
logic, I would go. Yeah, I know I
Yeah.
would go.
Yeah.
But the danger in going, and not to make it just into the conversation entirely about this, but if I went, then there would be in my head there is a danger. And look, if I was to interview Tommy Robinson, or if I interviewed Count Dankula, there's some sort of implicit advocacy of like their ideas because I'm interviewing them. Well, I don't think that's correct.
Well, then
I don't think
own
that's
that.
right.
Then own that. I mean, you're aware of what the risks are, and this is a very kind of materialist analysis. Is that I know what might happen, so do it and own whatever your decision is. I mean, I'm not going to tell you don't go or don't, but then if people start reacting negatively, and especially that you're aware of it, don't suddenly become a victim.
No, of course not.
Yeah.
Do you agree with the way that people are, that they would put, it's like putting 2 and 2 together and getting 22.
Yeah, but that applies to anything. If I choose to wear miscolored socks, if I like a specific
Viva la revolution.
if I like a specific pop song that other people don't like that's just living life. That's just peopling, to use your like
That's what people do, right? The people.
That's what it is. So you do you, and then if you want to stand by what you say, then stand by it.
I think maybe to add some meat to the bones of what Jade's saying is something that I've realised more recently. Well, no, I mean I've realised
gone
recently
from ghosts to skeletons.
People don't always act the way you want them to, or the way you would like them to. And sometimes you just have to accept that people will act the way they will act. And that's what I mean by peopling, is that in a perfect world, other people will see a very superficial snapshot of what you've done and be curious to understand the deeper motives and whatnot behind it. But what people generally do is make rash judgments.
But that's just the nature of
simplistic conclusions.
And that's peopling.
Yeah,
and
that's just the nature of socialization, right? Like, I know Elliot is not is not goose stepping around his house like, because I know Elliot, right? But then there are other people who might be watching your YouTube video and who don't know Elliot and go, wow, this guy seems like someone who goose steps around this house. And there are ways in which you can control your image, and you need to make that choice as a free individual. Where do I draw the line? What do I want to be associated with or not?
Have you considered getting Owen Jones on the couch?
I don't know what my image is. I don't know what my image is.
So are you saying that everyone everyone ultimately needs to be cognizant of how they're being portrayed, or how they're portraying themselves?
It's an extra dimension. It's an extra dimension.
I think everyone implicitly is. I mean, think about going to a job interview, right? Even at that basic level, you're like, oh, I'm gonna wear my best suit and my tie, and I'm gonna make sure I don't say and I'm not gonna fidget and whatever. Like, I taught this stuff. This was my past life. So a lot of us do these image control things implicitly. So I don't see it. It's that kind of meta extra, kind of effort someone is putting in. Yeah. I mean, but also there is a materialist aspect to it. The reason why I can write my political opinions and be unabashedly a Marxist is because I'm not worried about being fired from a job or from doing or X, Y, and Z happening to me. If one day, if this video is going to result in my lynching, then so be it.
Challenge would be a fine thing.
And that, going back to the idea of why people take other people's politics so seriously is because at the end of the day there is this materialist clash where it comes to a point where whose idea is going to win and how is that idea going to win.
And it's not always the one you want to win. It's not always the most rational, the most reasonable, or the one that you're most emotionally invested in. Yeah,
but just to generally round off what we were talking about with Sargon and Count Dankula and the like, I'm not looking for anyone's blessing, nor am I looking for sort of advice on what to do, but just generally like why it would be the case that by being seen with people like that you would somehow be labelled as something that you're not. I think
there's a general tendency among people, especially people who don't want to take the time to really look at the details of any given issue, to make these sort of snap judgments or heuristic assumptions about what's going on in a situation. And that again is just peopling. Like, that's just a thing that people will do.
Like, that's not just politics. That's, you look at someone and you go, that guy looks like a dick, and that's it. And like,
decision made.
That's just life. And everywhere there are these complex social negotiations as to whether or not you decide you want to have an interview with this person or not. It's kind of the same thing. I mean, it's not the same thing, but I draw a parallel to it. Then you being on a date and going, should I go in for this kiss or not? There's this, there's this kind of dance, this idea where you're running all these calculations in your mind. And that's just,
what sort of calculations do you run?
If I go in at this angle, right, at this velocity, but I mean, like, you obviously have, am I reading this right? Am I not reading this right? Is this going to be interpreted the wrong way? Is this, all of these things. And that's just, living with people. And, to misquote Sartre, hell is other people.
Hell is other people.
But yeah, like, it's just, that is a fact of life. See, not market economics.
This has come up loosely in our chats before, but what are your views on the Me Too movement? Just because you brought it up, I'm just curious to actually hear what your stance on it is.
I think we should just not.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Come on.
I mean,
let the man answer.
Gav, that's your thing.
Let him own it.
Okay, own it if you want to.
Well, you can answer the question any way you want, but just
honestly, I don't think I could do it justice.
Really?
No. Gav is feeling socially coerced. This is
are you uncomfortable?
Man.
You uncomfortable speaking about it?
No, not really. I'm aware that it's one of these issues
It's
that
like a hot button topic.
yeah,
Contentious,
this is a third rail issue almost, where it's very easy to say the wrong thing accidentally.
Okay.
I think the Me Too movement exposed the abuses of power in a lot of different places, and that was an important thing that needed to happen.
Yes. But superficially, what's wrong with what's happened with it?
I didn't say anything was wrong with it.
This is why Gavin's a centrist. No,
okay.
I mean, I'm comfortable saying that what I think I think the Me Too movement doesn't go far enough in its want to expose power dynamics and especially economic dynamics. The Me Too movement started from a underprivileged person of color going, hey, us people who work at the bottom have no way to fight against sexual harassment at work.
Is that how it started? I
Yeah.
thought it
Is that
started
how
with
it
Harvey
started?
Weinstein.
Yeah, I thought it started with Harvey Weinstein
that's
as well.
how it became.
Okay.
That's how it became the Me
Really?
Too movement.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Didn't know that either.
It was started by this person of color who, I don't know what industry she was working in, but it was some kind of menial service industry, and I don't use that in a derogatory way. It was just just manual labor, going. We have no protection against our bosses who sexually harass us and hold all sorts of economic and social power over us. It blew up.
How did it get co-opted by Hollywood?
Well, that's what Hollywood does. Have you ever seen
Yeah.
any kind of
Exactly.
movie?
Hollywood is all about riding the back of whatever people are talking about, and
Based on a real story.
Yeah.
Yeah, So yeah, that, and it's not to say that what happened in Hollywood is not an extension
course.
of
Yeah,
this
yeah.
kind of power dynamic.
Sure.
But by moving it into this kind of discourse, it has removed its potential revolutionary ability to go, well, the reason why women are mistreated at work is because there's fundamentally something wrong with our economic system. And it's the same thing with a lot of current discourse about diversity and
I don't
inclusion and
understand.
things like that.
I'm sorry. That for me, that was a non sequitur.
Okay.
I don't understand
The economic part.
Yeah, I don't
Yeah, I'm
understand
with that as
how for a man to abuse power over a woman is
Yeah.
inherently because of our economic system.
Yeah.
Well, a woman who does not have access to her economic needs, a person who needs to work, right, at any level, and because of that need, because of that economic need, it's very easy to take advantage of them socially.
But don't you think that even outside of that economic power dynamic, there's all sorts of ways for people to mistreat each other?
Yeah, I'm not saying that economic power is the sole way that people can mistreat each other. I'm saying that at the core of the Me Too movement is this economic dynamic where people who are at the bottom of the rung, who are economically disadvantaged, who need to work, otherwise they will end up in the streets, are required to work in these horrible conditions, be that in fruit picking, be that in janitorial services, be that in schools, be that in whatever. It is that dynamic where if I don't do this quid pro quo thing, my livelihood is on the line. That's what I mean.
Right. I mean, I can't disagree with what Jade said in that sense.
So,
Okay.
are we keeping score?
I think I'm winning if we are.
And that's the same thing with this whole diversity initiative, right? We need more women CEOs. No one is going, we need more women prison guards or whatever. So it is this very liberal perspective of what is successful is to be this parochial capitalist, and we just need more women who are parochial capitalists, and that's that's what the problem is. We don't have enough women exploiters. So that's my argument against.
Do you think we should have more women working in refuse collection?
No, I don't. I mean, that's my argument. My argument is that things should be left naturally to play out, and this is where weirdly,
Yes, equal opportunity versus equal outcome.
yes, but again, this idea of equal opportunity has a long-standing history when it comes to women being accepted into the workforce, women being, their womanhood being used against them in the workplace, etc. So it isn't just about equal opportunity, and this is where cultural things do come into play. And the Marxist perspective is that these cultural things are a product of capitalism. They are like a third level. The liberal thing is, we need to change the culture.
Do you think there should be more bin women?
To be honest, I don't care about the gender of the person who collects the...
Of course you don't, as long as it's getting done.
I mean, as long as they're treated well in their job.
Okay.
But I still see this as a non sequitur. I don't understand why. What I see is a very social thing. It's a social issue. This maybe presumption that certain roles are taken by certain people, partly social, partly natural. Maybe.
Yeah,
I don't understand why your argument that it's driven by capitalism. That if you were to remove capitalism, that it would somehow disappear.
Okay, so I'm gonna use some Engels here. Although again,
why don't you tell the people at home who Engels is?
So Engels is Marx's right hand. He pretty much funded Marx.
He was a capitalist, wasn't he?
He was. His dad owned a factory in somewhere in England. Yeah,
a bunch of textile factories.
A bunch, maybe. Yeah, they did. He was still a Marxist. Like the same way Elliot can go to a UKIP thing and not be a UKIP member. Look at that.
So much of this is getting cut.
Or none of it's getting cut.
So yeah, I mean the really interesting thing is, then the really weird thing is that Engels in his private life was a big what's the word I'm looking for?
Hypocrite.
Yeah, I mean in a sense, yeah. Yes. He didn't like women. Like
yeah. I mean
douchebag.
Yeah, a man of his time, probably as well.
Yeah. Although,
1840s,
yes,
not a time known for fairness towards women.
Although in his writings, he made a lot of arguments that would be considered feminist today, including his idea that the separation between man and woman was actually the first class separation before capitalism, and while he ties it to capitalism, the idea that the woman became subservient to the household when private property, which became the domain of the man because of biological differences, needed to prove who their offspring is, to be able to then pass on their private property and things like that.
See, I would never have interpreted that as a failure of capitalism. It's more religion and whatnot as well.
How so? Well, I mean, I'm not arguing that religion is not patriarchal.
Right, but I think
is.
A lot of the whole sort of women as property thing came from a lot of religious views at the time.
Yeah, well, again, this is where the Marxists tie in this materialist and historical perspective of, well, that this morality evolved as a basis of property relations. So you did have first private property relations and then the church and things. So moralities are built based on material conditions and property relations or class relations, etc. So again, it's the third level. So, social relations, property relations, moral relations as an interaction of the two.
Do you have another wild card to throw into this?
Not especially, actually.
So is there a Marxist morality? Given that Marxism is about kind of throwing away everything that, is presently considered to be morality, is there an alternative view of Marxist morality?
So Marxism is a materialist philosophy. So that automatically means no. There is no morality. The idea of Marxism is why, we will evolve from capitalism to communism, and it is important to note that Marx sees it as an evolution. He doesn't think communism is inherently bad. He just thinks that the time to evolve from it has long passed.
But what do you do about the fact that people will still people? As in, people will still look for
They will.
moral frameworks. People will
Yeah.
still look for ways to give their life meaning outside of whatever the state hands to them.
I mean,
or whatever.
this is where, I mean, I'm not going to go into what the state hands into them, because that's not Marxist interpretation. But it's this idea that that people will get to make their own morality, and right now they're not, because they are subjugated to capital. Because I need to, so one of the things that I write about or have written about. Ever written about
Have another
quite
drink,
frequently is this idea where the morality of the hustle comes from, right? And this is, I always try to relate, my politics.
You mean
to,
so Gary V?
the Gary V
You
kind
could have
of.
been a bus.
If you're not bleeding from your eyes, then you're not really working, and you don't really want it. And it's like, I don't want to bleed from my eyes either. Why is this an either or? And this is a morality that kind of comes out of this idea that all poor people are, it's of their own doing. That's completely, and I'll use myself as an example here. I always like to use John Rawls' statement, the lottery of life, right? Like, most of us have no control over what religion, what kind of economic class we're born into, what country we're born into. I mean, because all three of us were born in first world countries, our ability to travel and explore the world is so much easier than someone born in a third world country. So, and that's just the lottery of life. Like, my parents decided to give birth to me in Canada. I grew up in Lebanon. Most of my Lebanese friends, as Lebanese, to go anywhere needed to go through visas, etc. And I really lost my trail of thought. What was the question?
No problem. Let's go. I've got one, actually. I've got a topic, big topic.
Morality.
we can probably,
I remembered.
Okay.
Let him punctuate it.
All right.
Sorry. So yeah, it's the idea that morality rises from our material situation, circumstances, and by removing a lot of these financial circumstances, we can start creating our own individual moralities and living what liberalism has set out to do and was unable to do.
Do you think people can live entirely individual moralities, or do you think we need some sort of shared collective morality?
I don't think we need a shared collective morality. I think shared collective moralities will arise, but then they'll arise after,
The glorious revolution.
based on natural social relations. So obviously, without private property, labor will become a lot more important, especially as we start, let's say, with a scarce situation and move towards less and less scarcity. So labor is something that will become a sort of morality. Are you still working? Are you not working? What kind of work are you doing? But eventually, as we're able to sustain ourselves, because even if I take the argument that people are selfish and we want to develop in ways where we have to do less work and are more able to pursue our individual passions, and that's kind of the progressive history, the progress history will make, then we will be able to relinquish these kind of social moralities. And morality itself is a social thing.
Of course.
Yeah. So it changes. There we go. Point concluded.
Point concluded. We'll finish on this one, 'cause
Okay.
it's a big topic.
Okay.
Religion and God.
Oof.
What does it mean to you?
It's a massive topic.
Oof.
Do you want me to start? So it's interesting that Gav said he was raised in a religious household, because I was not. And I think we covered this in your first interview we had together. I was raised in a kind of almost violently secular household.
Violently secular.
Yeah, like where
Is that a Bible in your hand?
Yeah, well, like almost to that sense. My first interaction with religion was somewhere in elementary school, when we had a quiz and I saw other children having either a Quran or a Bible with them and reading these little passages, and I'm like, what's that? And they're like, well, if we read this thing, we do better on our exam. And I'm like, I want
Give
it on
me
that.
some of that.
Yeah, I want. You're telling me I can read a thing thing, and then I'll have better grades. Obviously, deal me in. So my friend goes, well, what religion are you? And I'm like, I don't know. And then he goes, well, how do you pray? And I'm like, I don't. And he's like, well, if you pray this way, then you're a Muslim. If you pray this way, then you're Christian. I mean, obviously, this is like,
primary school stuff.
Primary school stuff. So I go home and I ask my dad, I'm like, Dad, what religion are we? And he looks at me with, and my dad's a doctor, so this I think gives some background to this. And he looks at me and he goes, we are animals and the best of them. And I'm like, okay. Obviously as a kid, I'm like, oh, what do I know? And then, so that was interestingly my first interaction with religion. And it's interesting growing up in Lebanon. Lebanon's political system is still confessional, so your number of seats allocated to you in parliament is divided based on your confession.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're this type of Muslim, you get this many seats. If you're this type of Christian, you get this many seats, etc. So it definitely plays a large role in Lebanon, and I'm very, I think, grateful of this being raised secularly, because I wasn't dragged into that sort of politics. And I think that's what fuels my liberalism. And I use liberalism here in the sense of, do whatever you want, just don't get in my way kind of thing.
Yeah.
What does God mean to you?
God is the absurd. So I'll elaborate on that. So I've recently gone on an existentialist spell where I've read like 3 existentialist books back to back.
Camus.
I read
Kierkegaard.
Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche. And
Which Nietzsche?
Who's Nietzsche?
Which Nietzsche book?
Beyond Good and Evil.
Strong choice.
Yeah. And Kierkegaard stuck with me the most, mostly because he is religious, and it was interesting to see him try and reconcile religiosity with existentialism. And I think there's a lot to draw from there. So for me, the idea of God, or the way people perceive God, is this, beyond reason, beyond rational, or beyond the human ability of reason. God exists on a separate plane and all of that, is what I think what we would call in existentialism the absurd, is this randomness of life and inability to explain it, is the irrationality of life. So recently I've started thinking of God as that. And a lot of people find a sort of existentialist, what's the word I'm looking for here? Surrender through religion and God. And it's like, well, this is God's will. But from an existentialist perspective or a secular perspective, that's just shit happens.
Yeah.
Well, an
So
an existentialist might say that that's committing a philosophical suicide.
Yeah,
To resign to
and
religion,
it is. But I think one of the important things about Kierkegaard is he focuses about this idea of resignation. And in a way, it is this resignation to the absurd. I think it's wrong in the sense that when you start looking to God or religion to be your narrative or your reason of being, I think that is where it becomes divergent from existentialism. But I also think someone like Camus does that equally by saying we create our own meaning, knowing that life is inherently meaningless, and then creating your meaning is just adopting a fantasy that might as well be religion.
I think, my answers to the same questions would follow on directly from those points. I guess to do it in reverse order from what I planned, the meaning point is that I think human beings essentially seek to give their life meaning. That's a very sort of Jungian view of the world, but we can't really interpret the mind-blowingly absurd position we find ourselves in, on a rock floating in space in the middle of the universe, with and so we look to things like myth, art, and all these things to give our lives meaning, to give a reason to why we strive. Why do we expend our energy? Why do we delay gratification? Why will in a sense, religion is the ultimate delayed gratification, because it's sacrificing your entire life for the end benefit.
Promised land.
Yeah,
or
exactly, or whatever.
Kingdom
Yeah.
of heaven.
But I mean, even within the confines of this life, like, you know, why would you take on a venture like a business? Why would you take on a venture like a new relationship that might be, you know, challenging or whatever? It's because it gives meaning to the struggle, to the existence, and I think that's something that people crave as just part of existing as a human being. But also, I think what might separate me from a lot of people's political views, and I think this is a general divide between people, although I know how much Jade hates dichotomies, is the difference between looking at human beings as fallen angels versus animals. And in a sense, people who have a very religious background look at people as should be better than we are, but we're kind of backslidden in some sense, because we're all these perfect beings that can't live up to this ideal expectation that we live perfectly, which is a very religious way to interpret how human beings are. And the flip side to that view is the idea that we have evolved from animals, that we are animals in ourselves, and that all humans can really do to better ourselves is to transcend our animal nature, and that's a very deliberate, very difficult and challenging process. And I think that religion often disguises that by convincing you that you're some fallen angel rather than some animal that needs to transcend.
I want to tie this back to one of our earliest discussions about this idea of divorcing yourself from politics and the situation around you. Christianity and most religion actually arose from points in history where there was absolute chaos and instability. And it was at this stage when people started finding the idea of, you know, an afterlife, a, you know, kingdom of heaven type of thing really appealing to them, because they realized they have almost no control on their immediate you know, their ability to influence things.
And a lot of Buddhism and Stoicism is based on that. It's the idea that you accept your lot now.
So there's a lot of Christianity that kind of derives itself from Stoicism historically. So I think it's really important to understand that the act of faith is more to turn this inwards, you know, turn your back to society and the world and the fact that you exist right now on this floating rock, and try to better that and just turn inwardly and ignore all of that. But to go back to your more existentialist point about kind of seeking meaning, I think and this is I think where you and I fundamentally differ on this, I think by seeking meaning, you're kind of turning your back on the real meaning, which is that there is none. So you are creating this kind of false narrative, and then that narrative, that fantasy, what Kierkegaard, and this is why I think Kierkegaard is so important, is he talks about the ethical, and by the ethical he means the universal, so concepts like being successful, love, sacrifice, these kind of things. These are all moralities. I mean, whether or not they're universal can be argued.
I would argue they're more myths than moralities.
Yeah, so these myths, that by looking towards them, we're actually negating our reality and our ability to live life. We're kind of subjugating our identity to this myth, and by doing that, we stop living genuine lives. And
I would say that from my own personal experience, just, you know, from what I've lived through, anytime I find myself contemplating this sort of this abyss type view of nothingness and everything's pointless and stuff, it's a very depressing concept.
It is.
Yeah. But then the only thing that I'm able to motivate myself, to uplift myself and to drive myself to do things, is to pursue things like love, or success, and you might argue that those are mythic, but in pursuing them, that's how I feel alive.
No, my argument is not that they're just mythic, is that because they are mythic, they are based on our local and very temporal interpretations of what should be universal, right? So again, going back to this idea that what is universal is determined by our, you know, modes of production, by our property relations, all of that kind of thing. So now we look at love in one way. Obviously, it was different under feudalism. Obviously, it would be different under another kind of mean. So the idea that these definitions of these universal things are not set in stone. That's what makes our pursuit of them disingenuous.
But they're entirely relative.
They are relative.
I mean, my experience of love is different from yours.
Yeah, 100%. But we are also influenced by, let's say, Hollywood perceptions of what love is.
Sure.
The Notebook, and all, and like all these types of things. Like obviously, our conception of what is universal is socialized.
Yeah.
So that's why I go back to my point. If it's by denying these universalities, whatever, that we can actually tap in and realize our genuine passions and be truly radically free, and by embracing those, irrespective of what universe, whatever we're told we should think love is.
I do think this is a genuine sticking point between Jade and me, because like I say, for me, I genuinely feel alive when I might be taking a myth off a shelf in terms of what I view love to be.
Right.
But
and that's fair. Like I'm not saying you're living your life wrong.
Your love is a lie.
Yeah. Like, that's not what I'm saying. I just think that, and I think you're in many ways, the fact that you acknowledge that it is some kind of mythical narrative.
Right.
Yeah. And you have the right to choose that, of course, and pursue that. And if that's what makes you feel alive, then, power to you.
Yeah, but it's just...
Well, surely, love is to exist without judgment.
I mean, I think that's a very kind of wisdomy thing to say. What does that mean?
I don't know, parents judge the crap out of their kids.
Well, no, unconditional love is that you see everything as it is. Yeah, I don't really know, actually. It's quite difficult, isn't it?
I mean, it would make a killer placemat or something.
Yeah, it's a good bumper sticker, but I don't know if it's a good philosophy to live your life by.
In a more practical sense, I'm not sure that you can really give it. Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, guys, this has been like 2.5 hours.
I've enjoyed it so much.
It's been brilliant.
It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah.
If anyone has stuck with us until here, send me your address. I'll send you a check.
Yeah.
It's a prize giveaway.
George
Well
Soros
done.
will send you a check.
Just thank you to anyone that's watched this, listened to this. Drop us a note.
Join a union.
Say hello.
Leave a comment in
Leave a
the comment
comment.
section below.
Hit subscribe. Do something. Make a change in your life.
Oof.
Find love.
Find love.
Oh God.
On that note,
Is that your closing statement?
That's my
Find
closing
love
bit.
with
With a wink and a gun.
oh, man. Guys, just to add, thank you so much for coming, and yeah.
My pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thanks for the scotch.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Definitely
It was good.
lubricated the conversation.
Awesome. All right, guys. Cheers.
Boom.